In January 1893, 162 U.S. Marines landed in Honolulu. Their mission? Assist a group of wealthy American sugar barons in overthrowing the Hawaiian Monarchy. But this coup didn't start with soldiers. It started decades earlier, with sugar, trade wars, and economic ambition. This is a dark history of how the United States used tariffs to take Hawaii. The early history of the Hawaiian Islands was fascinating. Battles between neighboring chiefdoms were frequent, and the many inter-island rivalries created alliances that shifted as frequently as the tides. And while violence and political intrigue were prevalent, for the most part, things were stable. That was until 1778, when British explorer Captain James Cook arrived and pulled Hawaii into the modern world. When Cook first touched down on the islands, the native thought he was a god and welcomed him with open arms. Their embrace didn't last long, however, as they quickly determined Cook was quite mortal and killed him when he was caught trying to kidnap their king. And while Cook was now out of the picture, the presence of the modern world continued to grow as European and American ships began frequenting the islands. By the early 1800s, it was becoming apparent that all the large world powers had growing interest in Hawaii. This meant that the Hawaiian people had two options: band together or risk getting conquered. And in 1810, through a combination of conflict and diplomacy, King Kamehameha unified all 8 islands and the Kingdom of Hawaii was formed. The Kingdom of Hawaii quickly became a key stop for many traders as it was positioned as the center of a growing Asian trade network. And with this influx of traders, it began developing a healthy economy based around its sandalwood exports and the whaling industry. And as the kingdom began to blossom, the interest from France, Britain, and the United States started to increase, with each maneuvering to expand their influence over the islands. And one of their strategies to gain influence was by sending over missionaries. American Protestant missionaries arrived first, in 1820, and quickly began gaining favor with local leaders as well as introducing the natives to Western education and modern styles of governance. These efforts worked really well, and by the time French-backed Catholic missionaries arrived in 1827, the Protestants had amassed so much influence that they were able to convince the local chiefs to chase out the competing French missionaries and even issue a ban on Catholic worship. And as these American missionaries gained power, more settlers from the United States began to arrive, coming not just for faith, but for fortune. 2 of these American settlers were William Ladd and Peter Brinsmade. Ladd and Brinsmade were both New England businessmen with strong ties to the missionary community. And when they arrived in 1832, they came with the vision of starting a general store catering to traders on the Pacific trading routes. While their store was not successful, their business acumen helped them notice another, much bigger business opportunity: sugar. At the time, sugar was one of the most profitable cash crops in the world, with plantation owners in the United States and Caribbean making tremendous amounts of money. In Hawaii, though, it was only being cultivated on the islands at a very small scale. Ladd and Brinsmade understood that if they could develop a large-scale sugar plantation, the profits could be enormous. For them, there was just one problem. To get their plantation started, they needed land, and in Hawaii, the land laws didn't work like they did back in New England. Here, all the land was owned and managed by the king, not individuals. If Ladd and Brinsmade wanted to start a plantation, they would have to get the approval of King Kamehameha III. Luckily for them, he was already looking for ways to modernize Hawaii's economy, as the kingdom's other main industries, sandalwood and whaling, were both in decline. And this allowed them to strike a deal. Kamehameha III agreed to lease land to Ladd and Brinsmade at a rate of $300 per year, and in 1835, Ladd & Company, Hawaii's first true sugar plantation, was born. And while the success was not immediate, by 1837, the plantation was able to export over 4,000 pounds of sugar and 2,700 gallons of molasses. This proved that Hawaii was a viable location for the sugar industry. And once the word got out, American investment began piling in. American-owned sugar plantations quickly began sprouting up, and the dominance of the sugar industry in Hawaii grew with it. For King Kamehameha III, while the rise of the sugar industry was welcomed as it was growing Hawaii's economy, its growth did not come without issues. As sugar production grew, the influence of American investors and plantation owners grew with it, constantly challenging his power over his kingdom. In an attempt to mitigate American influence and help his people, Kamehameha III actively tried to incentivize natives to start their own sugar plantations through programs that included tax reductions and even outright providing the tools and processing equipment needed to cultivate sugarcane. Despite these efforts, the American sugar producers continued to dominate due to their greater financial resources and more advanced milling equipment. And because these new sugar barons and missionaries were deeply intertwined, both of their influences continued to grow, and they were able to work in tandem, pressuring Hawaii to adopt more westernized laws that helped American interests. This pressure accumulated in 1848 in an event called the Great Mahale, which redefined land ownership in Hawaii by classifying it into three distinct sections: the Crown lands, which were reserved for the monarchy, government lands, which were reserved for public purposes, and the Konohiki lands, which were given to local chiefs and land managers to lease or sell. And the consequences of the Great Mahale were that American investors and plantation owners began buying up significant portions of the Konohiki lands, turning them into sugar plantations and expanding the Hawaiian sugar industry. By the 1870s, sugar dominated the Hawaiian economy, and American sugar barons, who were now referred to as the Haole elite, were some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. To understand what happened next, we need to zoom out, because the Hawaiian sugar economy wasn't growing in a vacuum. They had major competitors, particularly in the American South, and these southern sugar farmers saw Hawaiian sugar and the Haole elite as a threat. They didn't want any foreign sugar, Hawaiian or other, eating into their profits. At the time, they were making a lot of money selling domestically, and they wanted to keep it that way. So to protect their business, they lobbied the government to add tariffs on sugar imports. This meant that any time Hawaiian sugar was imported into the United States, the Hawaiian sugar farmers had to pay an extra tax or tariff. And this tariff directly ate into their profit margin, making it more difficult for them to compete against the southern sugar farmers who didn't have to pay this extra tax. And these tariffs were actually fairly controversial, and they were fiercely debated all throughout the 1800s. And that's because tariffs create a very distinct trade-off. Essentially, whenever there's a tariff, the cost of an item will increase. And in this case, tariffs kept the price of sugar for American consumers artificially high, and that's something that they tend not to like. But on the flip side, the tariffs meant that southern sugar farmers didn't have to drop their prices to compete with Hawaiian sugar. They could keep charging consumers higher prices and keep all the extra profit for themselves. For the Haole elite, they understood that these tariffs were hurting their profits and they wanted the tariffs gone. And the thing that we have to remember about the Haole elite is that while they lived in Hawaii, they were Americans first. A lot of them had American citizenship, they had deep ties to American politics, and because of how fast the sugar industry was growing, they had a lot of money too. And this meant that not only did they have significant influence in Hawaiian politics, they had a lot of power in American politics as well. And they wielded it, lobbying for Congress to get rid of the tariffs. From 1840 to 1860, there were several serious attempts aimed at getting the tariffs dropped. Unfortunately for the Haole elite, they were all unsuccessful. However, in the later half of the 1860s, these lobbying attempts got more intense. At that point, the Civil War had just ended, and the United States was facing a massive sugar shortage. A lot of the southern sugar plantations were destroyed during the war, and this created a supply shock that sent sugar prices skyrocketing. Voters demanded cheaper sugar, and the tariffs became a political flashpoint. Furthermore, after the Civil War, the United States became very focused on expansion. The mindset was that they needed to grow the US empire, and the islands of Hawaii looked like the perfect place to annex due to its strategic location. As a result of all these factors, combined with the persistent lobbying from the Haole elite, the United States worked with King Kalakawa of Hawaii to pass what became known as the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875. This treaty did two main things. First, it removed all tariffs from Hawaiian sugar. This bolstered the Hawaiian sugar industry and the Hawaiian economy as a whole. And second, it put into writing that Hawaii could not cede or annex any land to any foreign powers. This was important to the United States because they knew that they were not the only country with their eyes on Hawaii. France and Britain were both working to make inroads with the kingdom too, and this treaty essentially blocked them from increasing their influence over the islands. For the Haole elite, the treaty was a giant success. The sugar industry boomed, and huge amounts of new money flowed into their pockets. From the perspective of the United States, the treaty was also a success. While King Kalakawa refused to cede any land, this was the next best thing. Removing the tariffs tied Hawaii's economy to the United States, or rather, made Hawaii dependent on the US. And while King Kalakawa was aware that his treaty posed some risk to Hawaiian sovereignty, other Hawaiian officials saw the risks more clearly. One Hawaiian legislator, Joseph Nawahi, went so far as to publicly call it a nation-snatching treaty. He foresaw that this treaty would lead to greater US involvement in the kingdom, and that it would eventually lead to Hawaii losing its independence. And he was right. After the Reciprocity Treaty, the United States' influence over Hawaii grew just like Nawahi predicted, and the Haole elite became even more politically ambitious. In general, the Haole elite were in favor of the United States annexing Hawaii, while native Hawaiians like King Kalakawa were more in favor of Hawaiian sovereignty. This difference in opinion created major tensions and led to continued efforts by the Haole elite to grab power from King Kalakawa. And unfortunately for Kalakawa, he made himself an easy target. He lived way beyond his means, and he even took out large loans from American creditors to pay for his lavish parties and other personal projects like the construction of his personal residence, Iolani Palace. And these vices made him a prime target for corruption. At one point, he even took a bribe from a Chinese businessman in exchange for the exclusive rights to sell opium in Hawaii. Even for many of the local Hawaiians, his unchecked extravagance and countless scandals made him difficult to support. However, despite all these problems, the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty remained key in the eyes of the natives. They didn't want to continue to be disenfranchised by the Haole elite, and they continued to rally behind Kalakawa, who was a leader fighting for their rights. King Kalakawa knew that his power was under threat, and understood that if he was going to gain leverage over America and the Haole elite, he was going to need to form new alliances, and that's exactly what he attempted to do. In 1881, he embarked on a world tour with the goal of brokering new alliances and elevating his status on the world stage. He met with world leaders like Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, and Emperor Meiji of Japan, and even tried to negotiate an arranged marriage between his niece and the Japanese prince, which would have put Hawaii under Japan's military protection. Unfortunately for Kalakawa, Emperor Meiji did not accept the offer. When that plan failed, Kalakawa shifted his efforts to unifying Hawaii with Tonga and Samoa. He had had a long-standing vision of a unified Polynesia with Hawaii at the helm, and he believed if he could bring together the three kingdoms, they could better resist American and European imperialism, which was actively threatening all three of them. However, when the major powers learned of Kalakawa's plan, they viewed it as a serious threat. Germany and the United States, who were both vying for Samoa at the time, worked aggressively to block any alliance. This strained the relationship between Hawaii and the United States, but not to the point that they became enemies. Hawaii remained the crown jewel of America's Pacific ambitions. This limited the types of responses that the US could pursue in regards to Kalakawa trying to ally with Samoa. Additionally, the Reciprocity Treaty had made it so that the Hawaiian economy was heavily dependent on the United States. This made any sort of political maneuvering by Kalakawa extremely risky, as any blockage to US markets could have severe impacts on the Hawaiian economy. Simply put, the two nations needed each other, yet were still each actively working to gain leverage over the other. And for Kalakawa, there was another major layer of political complications. His kingdom was divided between the native Hawaiians who wanted political sovereignty and the Haole elite, who were both aligned with American interests and actively clawing away at his authority. And one of the people clawing away at Kalakawa's the hardest was a rising leader named Sanford B Dole. Yes, like the fruit company, though that was his cousin, and that company wouldn't be founded for another 2 decades. Anyway, Dole was born in Hawaii to American Protestant missionaries, studied law at Williams College in Massachusetts, and when he returned back to Honolulu to practice law, he found himself getting deeply involved with the wealthy sugar barons and Haole elite, where he earned a strong reputation by publicly criticizing King Kalakawa and advocating for legal reforms aimed at reducing his power. And Dole's continuous pressure worked. By 1887, Kalakawa's power had weakened so much that the United States realized it now had significantly more leverage over Hawaii and decided to renegotiate the Reciprocity Treaty. And because of this change in the power dynamic, the US was able to extract a lot more concessions. While the US didn't push to annex the islands, they were able to secure exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor for their navy. This was very important, as tensions between the United States and other global powers in the region were growing. By securing Pearl Harbor, the US didn't just strengthen its hold on Hawaii, it expanded its military reach across the Pacific. And with the US's new military presence, Dole and the Haole elite became even more emboldened in their quest for power. Secretly, a number of them got together and formed the Hawaiian League, a tight-knit group of powerful Haole leaders with the specific goal of bringing down the king. Their first order of business was to mobilize support among foreign residents and sugar farmers by spreading anti-monarchy propaganda through newspapers, speeches, and political circles. This was a relatively simple task, as this audience already viewed Kalakawa as extremely corrupt. However, while the Haole elite were receptive to this message, most native Hawaiians were not. They understood that these attacks were a power grab, and that the Haole elite's quest for more power would eventually lead to more native disenfranchisement. So the natives countered with their own narrative, spreading their message in newspapers and even coming together in public gatherings to protest these power grabs. Unfortunately for the natives though, their resistance didn't stop the Hawaiian League. The League continued to grow, eventually securing the loyalty of a powerful militia group called the Honolulu Rifles. Ironically, the Honolulu Rifles were formed in 1884 at the behest of King Kalakawa and initially served as his honor guard. And when they formed, they were composed of many members of both Native and American ancestry. However, in 1886, a former American Civil War officer took command of the group and quickly began weeding out and silencing many of its Native members. And by the time the Hawaiian League was formed, the Honolulu Rifles were almost entirely composed of men that were naturally sympathetic to the Haole elite cause. And once they pledged their loyalty, it gave the Hawaiian League military muscle that rivaled that of the Hawaiian Monarchy. And with this new muscle, the Hawaiian League was able to go public. They started expressing their demands and began displaying impressive military shows of force. The Hawaiian League's pressure on Kalakawa was relentless, and if he didn't accept their political demands, it was clear the Hawaiian League, backed by the Honolulu Rifles, were ready to turn violent. The situation hit a breaking point in early July 1887, when the Honolulu Rifles surrounded the King's Palace at the behest of the Hawaiian League. King Kalakawa was now backed into a corner, and there was no way out. There, the League's president, Lauren A. Thurston, presented Kalakawa with an ultimatum: formally accept the Hawaiian League's demands, or suffer the consequences. With no real choice, Kalakawa painfully accepted their terms and signed what became known as the Bayonet Constitution. This was a whole new constitution, which fundamentally shifted the balance of power from the monarchy and native Hawaiians to the Haole elite. The Bayonet Constitution did several things, including stripping King Kalakawa of nearly all of his executive power, reducing him to merely a figurehead. Additionally, it strongly disenfranchised native Hawaiians by taking away many of their voting rights, as well as giving more voting rights to the Haole elite. And finally, it paved the way for a full annexation of the United States. This was essentially a soft coup. Kalakawa retained the title of king, but all of his power had vanished. And the Hawaiian League kept Kalakawa for a very strategic reason. Ousting him entirely risked immediate chaos. If they had removed him fully, they would not only have to be worried about uprisings from the native Hawaiian population, but also of retaliatory measures from the European powers like Britain, who had diminishing yet still significant influence on the kingdom. And this strategy proved to be a success. Once the Bayonet Constitution was signed, everything went smoothly for the Haole elite, at least for a while. And this is where we need to zoom out again, because the United States was about to do something that would change everything. In 1889, just 2 years after King Kalakawa signed the Bayonet Treaty, the United States elected a new president, Benjamin Harrison. Harrison replaced Grover Cleveland, and the differences between their international and economic policies were stark. Despite the United States as a whole being fairly motivated by expansion, Cleveland was staunchly anti-imperialist. He believed that the US should focus on domestic issues, and that by acquiring overseas territories, the US risked entangling itself in costly and unnecessary foreign wars. Harrison, on the other hand, was the opposite. He was pro-expansionist, and perhaps more importantly, Harrison was a lot more protectionist. While Cleveland was in favor of free trade and low tariffs because it led to lower consumer prices, Harrison wanted high tariffs, believing that they protected American industries and workers. And this was a very important issue at the time, because this was a period of major economic tension between the global powers. Britain was the world's economic juggernaut, but they were facing a lot of competition from other major nations, particularly the United States and Germany. And this environment put every country in a position where they had to find the right balance between economic protectionism, which helped to grow their domestic industries, and free trade policies, which created cheaper and often better products for consumers. And because Harrison was a staunch protectionist, one of his first major acts was to implement a new protectionist measure called the McKinley Tariff. This did a number of things. First, it raised tariffs on most imported goods by nearly 50%. This was a huge amount. For sugar imports, though, it actually did the opposite. The McKinley Tariff removed sugar tariffs across the board and instead instituted direct subsidies to American sugar producers to keep them profitable. And there was a strategic reason for the removal of sugar tariffs. Harrison understood that the increased tariffs would cause retaliatory measures from all the European nations, which would inevitably result in decreased American exports. This was going to hurt many US industries, so to offset these losses, his solution was to secure the Latin American markets. And in order to get the Latin American countries not to cut off their markets like Europe, he needed to extend an olive branch. And this olive branch came in the form of the removal of sugar tariffs. Remember, since the Reciprocity Treaty, Hawaii had been the only nation that was allowed to export its sugar to the United States duty-free. This special status had bolstered the Hawaiian economy and made the Haole elite fabulously wealthy. This was because at this point, the Hawaiian sugar industry was just more efficient than the American sugar industry. However, now that the tariffs were removed for everyone, the Haole elite had to compete for the American sugar market on an even playing field with other major sugar producers like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil. And when the Haole elite learned about the McKinley Tariff, they were furious. Their competitive sugar advantage, which had previously made them ultra wealthy, was now gone. Almost immediately, cheap sugar from Latin America began pouring into the US, and Hawaiian sugar profits plummeted. For the Haole elite who were now suffering, the solution was obvious. In order to be competitive in the sugar market again, they needed to get the same subsidies that the American government was giving to the American sugar producers. But because the subsidies were only for American sugar companies, to get them, it meant that they needed Hawaii to become part of the United States. So almost immediately, they began plotting ways to make that happen. Additionally, the McKinley Tariff put King Kalakawa in a tough situation too. His biggest priority was still fighting for Hawaiian sovereignty, but ensuring a thriving economy, and more specifically a thriving sugar industry, was nearly just as important, as sugar was the biggest driver of the kingdom's wealth. And despite the fact that most of his power had been forfeited when he signed the Bayonet Constitution, he still had some influence as a figurehead, and in late 1890, he sailed to San Francisco to discuss a tariff with American diplomats and try and find a solution. These discussions lasted for several weeks, but during that time, his health deteriorated quickly. On January 5, 1891, King Kalakawa suffered a serious stroke and eventually died a few weeks later from its complications. And when he died, it created a power vacuum back home on the islands. While the Haole elite largely had him under their control since the signing of the Bayonet Constitution, his sister and successor, Queen Liliuokalani, was much bolder and would not be controlled nearly as easily. This created significant tension, as the Haole elite remained focused on a full annexation of Hawaii, while Queen Liliuokalani was steadfast on resisting annexation and bringing back native sovereignty. Almost immediately, Liliuokalani began rallying support from the Hawaiian people. This was difficult, however, as the Haole elite and the Bayonet Constitution had severely limited her ability to act decisively, which made any sort of resistance nearly impossible. Still, she pressed on, continuing to fight for Hawaiian sovereignty. In 1892, she backed multiple legislative efforts to amend the Bayonet Constitution, though each attempt was swiftly quashed by the Haole-controlled legislator. Frustrated, she decided to take matters into her own hands, and in 1893, she began consulting with key Hawaiian advisors like Joseph Nawahi, and together, they drafted a new constitution which essentially undid the Bayonet Constitution and restored power back to the monarchy. Liliuokalani's plan was to implement it on executive authority alone, skipping any need for legislative approval or a formal vote. However, her attempt to keep this new constitution under wraps until it was too late failed. The Haole elite had deep political connections and had been monitoring her every move, and when they found out what she was preparing to do, they immediately raised the alarm. They viewed her actions as a direct threat, and immediately began preparing a counter-response to stop her. Sanford B Dole began mobilizing the Haole elite and immediately contacted the top US diplomat to Hawaii. Dole knew that the diplomat was sympathetic toward the Haole cause and convinced him to request US military support to back their next plan of action. Within days, a group of 160 Marines from the USS Boston landed in Honolulu, ready to provide military backing to Dole, the Honolulu Rifles, and the Haole elite. These Marines were not only better armed than the Honolulu Rifles, but they also gave the coup an added air of legitimacy, ensuring that no Hawaiian natives would rebel with force. Then, on January 17, 1893, Dole, backed by the US Marines, secured all the key government buildings and issued a formal public proclamation. The Hawaiian Monarchy had been abolished, and it was being replaced by a new General Council, of which he was the chairman. For Queen Liliuokalani, there was nothing she could do but look on from Iolani Palace. Her throne was now gone. The coup had been successful. Interestingly, when the coup occurred, Benjamin Harrison was serving his last days as president. He had just lost his re-election to Grover Cleveland, the same man he had beaten to become president 4 years earlier. And his loss was in large part due to the McKinley Tariff that had created this situation in the first place. When the tariffs started, everyday goods became much more expensive, and the American consumer ended up being the ones footing the bill. This, in combination with a handful of other events, eventually led to the Panic of 1893, which was one of the worst depressions in American history. And it was this economic collapse that gave Cleveland the path he needed to run again for president and eventually win. And when Cleveland retook the presidency, he brought back a lot of his previous policies with him. Ironically, this included the reversal of the McKinley Tariff, which had crippled the Hawaiian economy in the first place. Additionally, he retained his anti-imperialist mindset. He truly believed that getting involved in the acquisition of overseas territories risked costly military conflicts that were not good for the United States. And when he learned about how US Marines aided the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, he was not happy. He issued a full investigation called the Blunt Report, which eventually found that the US had acted improperly and that the coup was not supported by most native Hawaiians. With the results of the report in hand, he even went so far as to say that the coup had been illegal and demanded that Queen Liliuokalani be reinstated. At this point though, the Haole elite were too powerful. They were not willing to give up control and flatly rejected Cleveland's request to reinstate the monarchy. Instead, they formally transformed the Kingdom of Hawaii into the Republic of Hawaii and elected Dole as president. This strategy allowed the Haole elite to retain power and wait out Cleveland's term until a more pro-imperialistic president was elected into office who was willing to annex Hawaii. And while the wait included another failed uprising from Queen Liliuokalani and her supporters, the Haole elite did not have to wait long. After Cleveland, William McKinley, the author of the McKinley Tariff, was elected president. Like Harrison, McKinley was not only pro-expansionist, he was a vocal advocate for annexing Hawaii. And midway through his presidency, on July 7, 1898, the United States officially annexed Hawaii. With the backing of the US military, the Haole elite had orchestrated one of the most consequential coups in American history. And perhaps what was most interesting about this coup was how it was spurred by tariffs and trade deals. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1865 bound the US and Hawaiian economies together, making Hawaii dependent on the US for prosperity. And later, the McKinley Tariff of 1890 pulled the rug from under Hawaii, creating a situation that required Hawaii to choose between losing sovereignty or suffering a massive economic loss. And while the geopolitical world looks much different today than it did in the late 1800s, the debate around trade policies continues to be an important topic that has the ability to both forge and break alliances, oftentimes in unintended ways. Whatever the future holds, one thing is certain. International trade will continue to forge alliances, fracture economies, and redefine global power in ways we can't always foresee.